Hello friends, welcome to CEC Live Lectures. Dear friends, today in this session we are going to continue further in our series on basic sociology. Today we are going to talk on theory of Perret-Bourdieu, and for the discussion on the topic we have with us in our studios the subject expert Professor Maitreyi Chaudhary. Professor Maitreyi Chaudhary is a teaching in Center for Study of Social System, JNU. Dear friends, Professor Maitreyi Chaudhary is an eminent expert, and through her we always get in-depth knowledge on various topics. So let's welcome our guest Professor Maitreyi Chaudhary, and let's try to understand today's topic in detail. Let's try to understand theory of Perret-Bourdieu. Hello ma'am, welcome to the lecture.
So hello everybody, so we are back again, and today we are going to discuss, as you've already been told, Perret-Bourdieu. He was a French sociologist. He was born in 1930 and died in 2002. He was one of the most influential theorists of the 20th century. Last time we discussed Foucault, and like Foucault, both Bourdieu and Foucault had very, very long-lasting influences on just not sociological theory or sociology, but across disciplines, across anthropology, political science, media studies, humanities. So that interdisciplinary nature is something that you ought to talk about. So Perret-Bourdieu, as would be evident from his name, was French. Unlike Foucault, he was born to a relatively poor family, a working class background. And his early years, in a certain sense, defined the way he looked at the world and in his theoretical ways. There are a couple of points, general points, that I would like to talk about before I start talking about Bourdieu and his theory itself. And some of these, you would be aware, are things which I repeat in every class because these are themes which run across colors. So the first point that I am very particular about emphasizing is about contexts. And when we talk about context, we mean location, both temporal and spatial. What do I mean by temporal? What do I mean by spatial? By temporal, the time that they occupied in the historical frame of things, and spatial by the physical or geographical space they habitated. So he was French, as would be evident. He was somebody who also lived the greater part of his life in the 20th century. And the 20th century, as you're very familiar, was very eventful years of global developments, 2 world wars, geopolitical transformations, Cold War, the rise of socialist states, the contradictions that emerged, great technological advances, third world powers arising. So that period, the emergence of very strong anti-colonial movement did play a part on Bourdieu. So location, temporal, spatial. He was French, and as we are familiar with, France was a colonizer of Algeria. So in fact, Bourdieu's first works was an anthropological work in Algeria. That particular training, dealing with fields of investigation and empirical work, informed much of his later theoretical writings. He is one of the persons who sort of really paid a great deal of attention to the relationship between theory and empirical research. So first point was context that I wanted to emphasize. The second point, that to understand Bourdieu, you have to understand his great concern of not looking at theory as an abstracted phenomena cut off from the empirical world, but as theory which defines our everyday world or our everyday practices. The third point which I want to emphasize, and that is something which runs across all thinkers and all theories that we've done so far, that is the basic question of what is the relationship between structure and agency. What do I mean by that? Structure, society, that how does society constrain us, influence us, limit us, impinge upon our ways of doing, thinking, acting, speaking, dressing, and agency, how far are we free? How do individuals can manage to negotiate and transform society, or manage to work out balances and negotiations with society? Bourdieu was not happy enough to define broad outlines of what is structure and what is agency. He wanted to delve into the actual mechanisms by which structure is reproduced and the individual is reproduced, the role of language, the role of learning, socialization, disposition, terms which he used, habitus, capital, these are terms which he used, which we'll do in greater detail as we move forward. But I wanted to draw your attention to the fact that his focus on delineating or mapping the actual mechanisms by which structure is produced and reproduced. And the second thing that I want to draw your attention to, his constant to and fro between empirical demonstration and theoretical working. I am going to mention some of his major works, but that does not mean that this includes everything that he has written. He was a prolific writer, but some of the things which he is very, very well known with are Outline of a Theory of Practice, The Field of Cultural Production, Language and Symbolic Power, Distinction, a Social Critique of the Judgment of Taste. And as we deal with the various concepts that defines Bourdieu's theory, you will notice what does he mean by a theory of practice, what does he mean by cultural production, why did he emphasize language and symbolic power, and what was this particular book, The Study of Distinction and Taste. We begin with some of the concepts which were very central to Bourdieu, and again a clarificatory remark which I would advise all of you to keep in mind, that when you look at or understand separate terms like concepts like social field or habitus or capital or dispositions, do not look at them as separate concepts. That's a very, very important thing. I know the manner in which our educational system operates and our pedagogic practices propel us to learn concepts by heart, to learn definitions. But remember, concepts are not to be learnt as definition. Concepts are to be learnt as tools which will help you to understand society, make sense of the world in which we live, and make sense of us as human beings occupying our own little positions in society. So what does Bourdieu mean by social fields? This is the macro concept that structures Bourdieu's thought and represents in a certain sense the entry point for Bourdieu's further concept. So all his concepts have to be understood in relationship to each other, and the field is the entry point by which we start making sense of the conceptual framework that he puts forward. And he means, and he goes on to develop, that the daily life of people, social agents, is determined by an infinite amount of interaction, example, discussions, negotiations, or conflict. In order to grasp these interactions, it is important to first understand the circumstances and the place where these are produced. In other words, interactions have to be considered in their respective social space that is subdivided into different social fields. Here I have just read out, but what is very important is that you have to understand what each of this means. It means that each of us, people, in our everyday life, occupy certain spaces and positions in society. We interact with other people. We are sometimes friendly, sometimes have discussion, sometimes we conflict. And it is this world that we habitate which is our field. The fields can be very different. In my daily life, I wake up in my home. If I am alone, I wake up all alone. If I am in a family, I wake up and I interact with other members of the family, which could be at that point of time the field which I occupy. But when I leave the home and I go to work, I occupy the field of my professional life. So since I teach in university, it could be my fellow teachers, it could be my students, it could be the administrative parts. But it is not just those aspects of interaction which are face to face. When we say interaction, it doesn't mean just what I am saying to somebody and what the other person is saying to me. But what it means is that we are all governed in our specific fields by rules which may not be immediate. So if I go to a university, the university has a particular structure within which it operates. It's a relationship to the UGC, rules which govern our own center, its own history, its statutes, its practices. Those too become part of our fields. There are also things which may develop out of custom and convention. Those too become part of our field. And these interactions have to be considered in their respective social space that is divided into different subfields. And each of us, as an everyday person going around in our daily work, have occupy different fields, move from one field, move into another, occupy interstitial spaces between the field. Different social fields can be distinguished. Example, the field of art, literature, science, religion, or careers that can be further subdivided into subfields, biological research, management research for the field of science. Bourdieu understands these social fields as universe or microcosm in which the agents and institutions are integrated and interact with each other in accordance with field-specific rules. I want to constantly remind you that do not get caught in the words in which definitions are meant. Try to break them out and understand it in your own terminology or language. So the simple point, he says, that there are different social fields. So the field of academia, which I just described, teaching in a university, it could be the field of art, it could be the field of cinema, literature, maybe religion, maybe the economy. They are broad fields. They do not mean that they are occluded or separate from each other, interact with each other. Within large fields, you can have more specific fields or subfields. And this universe, or this social field within which we operate, are what Bourdieu calls microcosms, in which agents and institutions are integrated and interact. Who are the agents? Agents are people, individuals, actors in society, people like you, people like me. And the institutions are within which you are operating. I know that all of you are in certain institutions. You could be in a college, you could be a professional, you could be in a coaching center, you could be a working person, you could be a student. Whatever you are in an institution. You are also in a family, in kinship, in a religion, and all of this impinge upon what your rules are and how you interact. And each of these fields have certain rules which bind them. So rules are extremely important. What are rules? What do we mean by rules? Very often we are told that rules are always formalized. These are like law. Law is formalized. There are constitutional laws. There are penal laws. There are various kinds of laws which are written down, codified, sanctified, ratified by the state. Those are not the rules that we are talking about. Or to be more accurate, those are only partly the rules that we are talking about. Rules are not formalized but tacit in nature. What do we mean by tacit in nature? By tacit, it means that things which is not spelled out but we know by living in a particular system, unwritten, unstated. Tacit means unwritten, unstated. When we use the word in English, tacit understanding between friends, it means not something that is written out a contract saying, look, I'll be your friend, I will support you in your times of crisis. But what you are saying is they're unspoken, unwritten, but mutually recognized, mutually understand that if you are ill, I will go and look after you. When I am ill, you will come and look after me. But this is not by law, this is not explicit, this is tacit. Tacit means unspelled, unwritten, but, and this is important, mutually understood. Rules are not formalized always, but rather tacit in nature and need to be internalized by the agents in order to demonstrate appropriate practices and strategies. That is, how do we behave in life? Now, again, I want to draw your attention to the concept of internalization. Internalization, same point we discussed with Foucault earlier, we discussed with other thinkers. How do we internalize the rules that exist in a field or in society at a large? We internalize by practicing them, repeating them, so that at the end of it, it almost becomes part of our dispositions or our gestures, our body languages. So we are taught in many parts of our country, traditionally in particular, that you have to show respect to your elders. It is natural that therefore you get up if somebody who is older than you walks into the room. It's natural that you show some form of courtesy. In some parts you may touch their food. If you do not want to do that, you at least show by your body that you are deferential. You show respect. Now, every time you do it, you do not do it consciously. It becomes part of your bodily expression. It is that what he means by internalization. The example which Bourdieu gives is that he compares it to a good rugby player who anticipates where the ball will fall and who will therefore already be where the ball falls before the ball falls down. In a cricket game, for example, that you have an excellent cricketer, a batsperson, and the batsperson is not consciously thinking where will that ball come. It is almost instinctive. Through repeated practices, it has been internalized. Now, the further point that he talks about rules is there is no global rule that applies to all fields. The respective rules and conditions on a social field have to be found out by empirical research. Here again, I want you to draw your attention, his constant effort to say that, look, do research, do empirical research, and also have conceptual tools so they work together. Now I come to a broader question that are fields autonomous or determined? What do I mean by this? Before we discuss this, I just want to go back to the point that some of those key theoretical questions which Bourdieu raises has been raised repeatedly, like the structure and agency question, by scholars before. So the question, are fields autonomous or determined? And Bourdieu argues that due to their unique rules, fields are autonomous. However, he also qualifies that the autonomy is only relative, as fields are embedded in social space. For instance, the intellectual field may also be influenced by the politic, the economy, or religion. So now let's take the world I am most familiar with, the academia. Now the academia obviously has certain kind of rules which govern it. How we teach, what we teach, certain kind of codes which become internalized. For example, it has become internalized for me that, look, when you read a particular theory, don't try and memorize it, learn it. And this is something I learned from my teachers in turn in my university, that learn theory as critique, learn theory as explanatory possibility. So this has become internalized, and it is in a certain sense autonomous or separate or specific to the academic world. Does that mean that the academic world is independent of politics, economy, or religion? We know very much that that is not so at all. In different kinds of political economies or regimes of political economy, you have different kinds of attempts to regulate educational institutions. So there could be a regime which feels that there should be great state funding to universities so that you could reach out to the marginalized. There should be a certain amount of level playing ground, equity, social justice. In another regime, it could be competition, private profit, contentions that would be very different. So the academia will not only have its internal rules which are autonomous to it, but will also be influenced by other social spaces and other social fields, because a field, one particular field, is embedded in a society or social space which is occupied by many other fields. So here we came to autonomy. Now we come to the question, field as a locus of struggle. Now what does Bourdieu mean by that? This has to be understood again in the fundamental question which Bourdieu raises between structure and agency. He says a social field is a locus of struggle, network of position. Every one of us as individuals work in the field, and we have different kinds of intentions, aims, objectives, and we strategize to maximum our own objectives, our own goals. There is therefore a lot of what could be stakeholders and a game, and you are interacting with each other, and we do not know what exactly will be the output of those struggles, and therefore Bourdieu once again emphasizes find that out empirically. He also says that boundaries of social fields are not fixed. These are not predefined. They have to be found out empirically. For example, at one point of time, in traditional societies of a particular kind or early modern societies, the idea was that the family was a very private body, and this field has boundaries which the public sphere should not intrude. That is, public law cannot intrude or state law cannot intrude. So if you have a practice of wife beating, then people would say that's their personal business, that's their private business. Aapasi ka mamla hai, so you don't interfere in it, and the state has no role in it. But in another context where you may have the emergence of a women's movement, human rights movement, questions of democratic rights, violation, a movement against violation, then you may have new laws like we've had in our country, maybe the domestic violence bill, maybe anti-dowry, where you say the state does have a role to play in negotiating what goes on within the family, that there are fields. So the boundaries get expanded. The boundaries are not fixed, the boundaries are flexible. What about another category which is very important to understand field, to understand structure and agency, to understand fields as sites of struggle, is the concept of position. Position refers to a given conceptual location of relative status, power, dominance, subordination, or equality. For instance, and he again gives an example from the academia, you would have an assistant professor, a research assistant, a professor, a full dean, administrator, vice chancellors, students. You have various kinds of positions which in another, say in the structural functionalist framework, you would call status. And this locations, everyone is working along with each other in terms of the rules which govern them, but also strategizing to maximize what their particular goal is. Here we must also refer to the idea of power, which in the case of Foucault we saw was seen as pervasive. But in this particular case, we see that he is saying that there is power everywhere, but he's also making hierarchies of power, that you may have rules within the academia, powers within the academia, but the state power will also be overbearing. There will be also class issues which would bear upon power. So the question of power, which we again see like structure and agency, runs through all the theorists and thinkers. I want to return back to the point where we begin, because in a certain sense it all gets addressed to this question, the question of structure and agency. And if you notice, go back and read, read Marx, read Weber, read Durkheim, read Mead, read the ethnomethodologist, read the news, the Frankfurt School, you will see this is an unending question, a question which has haunted philosophical writers and has haunted sociology, social anthropology, political science, history. It's almost in a certain sense like the question of the chicken and the egg. The two issues are basically what do we mean by structure and what do we mean by agency. That when we ask how free are we, how free am I, then it's the individual that is being looked at, individual freedom. When I ask the question, how constrained are we, that is, I'm asking the question, how defined or limited or influenced or bound am I by the structure? And the question, which has been raised by earlier thinkers, particularly Marx, and a thinker whom Bourdieu goes repeatedly to, is that I am free to teach you in the way I feel best as of now, that is, I am free, but I am not free in terms of the time constraints that is there, what I am allowed to say in which specific point of time, whether I should have a PowerPoint presentation or not. These are the structures within which I am operating, and those structures in a certain sense constrain me. This is what Marx called dialectical relationship, mutually reciprocal, both impacting each other. So Marx's famous definition is that humans make history, or men make history, but not as they wish, because we are both products of history and producers of history. Bourdieu basically operates with that understanding of structure and agency. Structures, how do they operate? Acts as rules and determine and conditions individuals' thoughts and behavior. A pure structuralist perspective would imply that people behave as robots that are programmed to act in accordance with the structured patterns, a perspective that appears obviously too rigid. So structures act as rules and determine and conditions individual thoughts and behavior. I would ask you to think for yourself, each of you, how do structures as rules determine your behavior? I mean, you are free to listen to this program live if you wish to, but you are not free to see it live any time of the day, because that is defined by the rules which the particular UGC EduSat program has for you. There's a particular structure, a schedule, and they would in turn decide how free you are. Likewise, ideas of what is good, what is bad, what is a good girl, what is a bad girl, what is a successful man, what is an unsuccessful man, are structural rules which operate upon us. However, it does not mean that we are passive victims, that we can't negotiate with this. It is this negotiation that Bourdieu repeatedly addresses, structure and agency. Thank you.
With this note, thank you, ma'am. Thank you so very much for giving us this session on Pere Bourdieu. Dear friends, there is a lot more for you. You are requested to be with us as we are back after a short break. Thank you. Hello friends, welcome back to this session. Friends, as you know that today we are talking on the thoughts of Pere Bourdieu, and for the discussion on the topic we have with us in our studios Professor Maitri Chaudhary. Professor Maitri Chaudhary is a renowned professor, and through her we always get in-depth knowledge. So let's welcome our guest Professor Maitri Chaudhary once again, and let's try to understand the more thinkings of the thoughts of Pere Bourdieu. Hello ma'am, welcome to the lecture.
Thank you very much. So we sort of start off from where we stopped. We were talking about structure and agency. And I again want to emphasize, because this is something which will be constant in whenever you look at theory. Now, on one hand, you have a structuralist perspective, a pure structuralist perspective, which would imply that we are really robots, that the structure defines who we are, how we speak, what we do, etc. And on one extreme. On the other hand, what you would have is a voluntarism, the idea of voluntarism or an agency perspective, which suggests that individuals are completely free in their choices and always have many alternatives, and they can do whatever they feel like. Now, in his theory of practice, Bourdieu attempts to overcome these dualities. He explains strategy or practice by complex interplay of his main concepts, namely field. We have already discussed the idea of field in some detail, then habitus, and then capital. I'll be sort of emphasizing on habitus and capital now, but again, each of these concepts are related to each other. So, extremely difficult to explain any one concept in isolation from the other concept. And I would be absolutely delighted if this particular point is grasped by all of you, the fact that concepts are interrelated, connected with each other. Now, I want to begin with his basic concept. We've seen field, and we said this was the entry point to understand Bourdieu's theory. We now come to his concept capital. Capital as a principal cause for distinction. People are endowed with a specific quantity and structure of resources they can put at stake in order to obtain the right to enter a social field or an entry price. Each field values particular sorts of resources that Bourdieu names capital. Basically, we talked about positions, we talked about locations, we talked about field. Now, what he's saying is that all of us occupy different positions in society or in the social space, and each field appreciates some kind of resources, and these resources are not equally divided among all members of society. The point that Bourdieu mentions about power, it's unequally distributed, unequally accessed. I mean, this is something very obvious for Indians who live in a very unequal society, that our access to resources or access to capital are very, very different. And he uses this word that you can actually use them to obtain an entry price. Now, very simple example, controversies which run a lot in our country, that you can't get admission and so you pay a certain price to get into a private college. You don't get admission and you pay a certain price in terms of the contacts you have or the contacts your mother or father has to get a particular position or a job in a public sphere or a public university or college or educational institution, or maybe a public bank or a public office of any other kind. So you have unequal resources. Some people have nothing. Some people have absolutely nothing, in the sense that some of us may not be able to get into private universities, but we would have other skills which Bourdieu calls cultural capital in order to enter into public universities. But there may be others who are not able to they do not have even the basic economic capital to go to school. So if you cannot go to school, how on earth are you going to move forward to move into colleges or universities? So capital is, according to Bourdieu, a very principal cause for distinction. Now, what are the different kinds of capital which exist? And he has a couple of distinctions that he makes here: economic capital, cultural capital, symbolic capital, social capital. Economic capital is the money, the credit, the inheritance, properties, or other means for acquiring and controlling people, goods and services. The whole idea of capital, which will have that kind of tangible. Here there's a small distinction that needs to be made between Bourdieu and Marx, because when Marx uses the word capital, he is using a capital as a large encompassing term, which within it has both economic, symbolic, social, cultural premium. Here, Bourdieu, because his great interest was to make empirical sense through categories, has spelt them out, spelt and separated them for analytical purposes. Does not mean that they operate in isolation from one another. If you are rich, then you're most likely possible that you have social capital too. So if you have economic capital, if you have big houses, property, cars, you go to a private club, you go to schools which are prestigious, then you also are likely to have social capital. What do we mean by social capital? Social capital are friends, social class of family, social connections to people with money, power, or both. Social capital is associated or linked with economic power, enhanced in those judged to have a minimum degree of separation from others in power positions. So they may be a little separate, but they would also be operating in tandem. There is cultural capital. Cultural capital is inheritance, upbringing, education, how you talk, how you speak, how you dress, how comfortable you are moving with important people. I want to give you an example because this is something which I noticed while watching television, and this particular point was that what I was noticing was that, there's this huge scandal about Nirav Modi and the money that he made and how he ran away. But I was more interested to see all the visuals which were flooding television pictures of him, who looked so comfortable and so very comfortable in the cultural, symbolic, economic capital that he had as he posed with models across the world, as he moved through those diamond stacked displays. There was this whole sense of a separation from the ordinary lives that we inhabit. This cultural or symbolic capital, this social capital is impossible for most people to have access to, and this social capital would not have been possible without the economic capital that this person has. Cultural capital is something which is very often used in the study of education, and Bourdieu himself was very interested in studies of educational practices and schooling. So when you go to a very privileged or private school, there's a great deal of effort which goes into making you, speak in a particular way, walk in a particular way. In more contemporary liberalized India, you have references to finishing schools, how people should dress, how people should talk. I have noticed on television, in fact, programs which are run which actually tell you how to dress, which kind of situations, how you should dress, how you should eat, how you should have your wine, how you should interact. Now, those things have to be learned by people who are not brought up in such families where that becomes culturally available to them without them being even aware or conscious. It could be reading habits, books that you read, familiarity with particular kind of sports, ability to discuss politics, maybe music, maybe classical music, maybe classical dance, maybe a certain affinity to certain kind of films that you watch. That is all cultural capital, and they legitimize the world that we live in. That look, this person is somebody because that somebody has the cultural capital. Symbolic capital is the other term which Bourdieu introduces. And what does he mean by symbolic capital? He means prestige, honors, distinction of some form linked to cultural capital, although not necessarily position for power or economic capital. But you have them with you, that they help you, that you are somebody who is somebody with great status, prestige. People are not going to be rude to you. Sometimes these forms of capital operate in a very natural fashion, and you're not even aware about it. For example, in our country, where as you age, people do tend to look at you with certain grade of respect. So people will not necessarily always be very rude to you. There will always be cases where this could be violated, but you get away as they say, with cultural capital. But if you are unfamiliar, if you look at some of those old Hindi films or films from other regions of the country where you have the standard person, the hero is somebody who's from the village, who's never been to the city, doesn't know how to sit on a restaurant, doesn't know how to talk to young fashionable women from the cities, or do not know how to act powerful in an office job. When he comes to the city, he lacks all the capital, the cultural capital, the symbolic capital, the social capital, the economic capital. That has to be learned. But normally in our everyday world, it's not necessarily learned explicitly. Remember the word tacit knowledge, tacit understanding. We learn it almost without us realizing it. We learn what is our taste. Why do we like a particular kind of tea and not like another kind of tea? Why do we like particular kind of coffee and not another kind of coffee? A particular kind of food, parathas, and not another kind, is because all of it we've learned and internalized. The capital too gets internalized with people, and this, as you're aware of, is differentially allotted to different people in society. I come to the next point, because the point that Bourdieu was very interested to is not that you learn what the meaning of capital is or the meaning of field is, but what is the relationship between position, capital, individual strategies. Battles between agents are principally about relative positions within the field, maximizing capital, individual strategies in conformity with the rules of the game, structure of objective relation between the agents on a field that define dominant and dominated positions, and that determines what agents can and what they cannot do, which practices are possible and which not. I would encourage you to think about examples. For example, if somebody is of great power and is vested with great economic, social, symbolic, cultural capital, they would not usually know how to behave in a subordinate fashion. They are used to being the boss. They find it natural. Now, if you come from a background where we are not necessarily equipped with the same kind of capital, you devise strategies how to make or how to endure yourself to the person who has all that capital. Now, there is a very well-known phrase by Scott. Maybe in a lecture ahead we could discuss the whole question of weapons of the weak, that when the weapons of the powerful, the person who's endued with all the capital, is explicit. So you're angry, you throw the glass. You're angry, you throw a file. You're angry, you may even lift your hand. You're angry, you kick something. Those are expressions of anger by people who have power. What are those people who don't have that kind of capital, cultural, symbolic, social, economic? How do you then negotiate? Because you can't do what the powerful can do. What you can do is what Scott defines as weapons of the weak, that you learn to be clever, you learn what the moves of the dominant are, what point you should be able to please them, what point you should make a request or not. It happens in the official spaces where you know the boss is in a good humor, so maybe this is the time to ask a favor from the boss. Within the families which are gender powered, very often, one's mother would say that I can't ask your father for this today. He's in an angry mood. Maybe he's in a happier mood. I'll be able to do. So the dominated, who do not have the same kind of cultural symbolic capital, they have to work out negotiative strategies, and so that they can play the rules of the game which are actually loaded against them. So you have to understand capital not just as a definition, but how capital as a structure impinges upon people and propel them to function in a particular world. I now come to another concept which many of you would be familiar with, habitus. And what is habitus? I haven't used the word habitus so far, but I have described what a habitus is. Habitus refers to a person's or a collectivity's combinations of dispositions, literally embodied, internalized, and expressed through the body. So when the powerful learns how to move with a swagger, learns to not care, not pay any attention to others, those become part. They've learned from the beginning, and that becomes almost the person's embodied expression. They're permanent guiding principles, prejudices, preferences. These preferences are classifying and self-classifying schemes with which people generate and organize everyday practices and representation. So habitas is the scheme of things, how we understand everyday world, and through which we start learning how to live in the world, that we must be going to school at a particular time. If we do not reach school at a particular time, we'll be punished. If we do not do well in school, maybe my mother will be very angry. If I am a woman, I should look feminine and not masculine. These are the small things which we learn as we grow up. They allude to a person's or collectivity combination of dispositions. And what are dispositions? Dispositions are tendencies, propensities, inclinations of individuals, institutions, or even things. Bourdieu uses the example of timidity and arrogance with which we associate body postures, stereotyped action, and even internal states of person. Think of a typical Hindi film scene or any other Indian regional film scene, where you would have the person maybe who is the zamindar, who is angry, who is throwing things, hitting people, kicking things, and you may have the peasant standing there with folded hands begging forgiveness. The entire body language of the person who is dominated expresses timidity, fear, deference. The entire body language of the person who may be the zamindar in the case, or maybe a colonial official, or maybe a particular bureaucratic officer, is of power, of arrogance, where you know that nothing can touch you. So this idea of dispositions are interrelated with the idea of the habitats, because where do you learn or where do you get those dispositions? It is by habitats, or the idea of growing up and becoming a part. Bourdieu's habitats is strongly connected to his concept of field. This is a point I've been trying to tell you repeatedly, that these concepts are interlinked. You can't understand one concept separately from the other concept. The class habitats that stems from a position on the social field leads to the doxa, the knowledge of what is taken for granted. Here, we're introducing another term. We discussed habitats, we discussed capital, we discussed field, we discussed disposition. Now we are discussing doxa. What is doxa? The knowledge of what is taken for granted on a field that sets social boundaries, limits our social behavior. In this respect, the habitats limits practices and strategies and entertains with the social world by ensuring that we act intentionally without intention, in conformity with our relative position on the field. It sounds complicated, it's not complicated if you spell these things apart and see what does he mean. A point that I've been repeatedly saying, doxa, knowledge taken for granted. The knowledge that I mentioned earlier in the talk, that if somebody elderly comes up, you get up naturally. If a woman who's never been exposed to interacting with men or mixed group, she will sort of cower on the side and feel very hesitant to meet people. She will be shy. And I'll probably maybe in my later lectures talk about this wonderful book, Sultana's Dream, where women are taught in a certain sign to be timid, to be cautious, to be awkward. So that's a doxa which we learn from the very beginning. Men are supposed to be macho, strong, aggressive. And in a contemporary world which is informed by social justice, protest movement, women's movement, new forms of socialization, girls may be taught to be assertive, go out and fight for their rights. But this doxa is an alternative doxa. So very often people will say that they are not good people. Look, they're making demands, they're going out and speaking. I mean, this is not correct. So doxa is something which helps us about how this knowledge which we take for granted, tacit knowledge, not made explicit, but knowledge which we learn just by living in the context that we do, that it becomes part of our bodily world. The habitus ensures that agents act accordance with the field-specific rules, as all agents tacitly recognize the value of the stakes of the game and the practical mastery of its rule. So if I am in an office, I know that the rules here means that I shouldn't upset my boss. I know that I can't challenge, I can't do kind of revolutionary upheaval of my boss, but what I can do is play the game, see what the boss likes, say the kind of things which the boss is pleased about. There's this whole joke which runs around about a particular person who wants to flatter her boss, and she tells her boss that, look, you're the first boss I've ever met who doesn't like flattery, and the boss is very pleased. So here is a subversive way by which we learn the tacit games, the tacit rules of the game, and this is the kind of doxa that we learn. So you have habitus, you have capital, you have field, and it is within all that that practice takes place. As I sort of slowly move towards the end of my discussion today, I want to go back to the question of structure and agency, and I want to reiterate why this is something, as you do your revision or go back and study, I hope so, the originals of many of the thinkers that we have done, look in to how they have understood structure and agency, and then compare it perhaps with how Bourdieu looks at structure and agency. Bourdieu understands habitus as structured structures that are predisposed to act as structuring structures. So habitus is something which has happened because the structure has created habitus, but habitus in turn creates structure. The same point which I said about dialectics, the whole question. Let's take another example. That in our family kinship system, as you know, our society is one where we call there's a son preference, and the son is very often pampered and given a lot of importance. The son is also told that you're going to bring honor and glory to us, you have to succeed, we depend on you, etc. And this broader structure of son preference, a patrilineal kinship structure, a patriarchal structure, a patrilocal structure, all of it creates the habitus within which a baby boy is born and brought up in many patriarchal families in our country, large parts of our societies, Now, so this habitus, where you treat your son differently, is an impact of the broader structure. But the fact that within your field you are acting in a particular way by which you say, look at the poor fellow, he's hungry, you must go and rush and give him food, and the sister can wait, or you can say that, the son is somebody who has to be given greater attention in certain sense or greater importance, that in turn structures the structure. So if you follow, first we behave like that because there is a broader structure, and when we behave like that, we reproduce that structure. On the one hand, the habitus is the result of social structure, more precisely of the social class, the doxa, and the rules of the game on the field that have been internalized, what he calls illusio. That is, we are so governed by these rules that we find it difficult to challenge it. This is something, since I work on gender, there's a wonderful book which talks about that she comes back to take her rights, वो आई वापस अपनी हक लेने के लिए, where this argument, if a girl claims property rights, which is allowed by law, she would be thinking that she doesn't love her brother enough. So on one hand, her behavior will be determined by this broader structure, where a good girl will not demand that, and when she doesn't demand that, it reproduces a structure which would assume that property rights have to be given from the father's line to the line of descent. So the habitus structures practices and reproduces social fields, since individuals strategize and practice as products of positions and rule inevitably assure the economic and social conditions for reproduction. This is the point that I am trying to tell you, that we are products of society, we are structured by the structure, but because we are structured and our habitus becomes influenced by it, we start behaving naturally through the doxa disposition in our habitus in a fashion which reproduces the structure. The individual, by acting in conformity with the structure is confirmed and reproduced. I want to come back to the last point, where I want to talk about why in the case of Bourdieu, because he was a theorist who was extremely important to looking into how theory and empirical research are intertwined, is the whole question of why he gave so importance to language. In fact, language, when we talked about capital and social capital, symbolic capital, cultural capital, the emphasis of language is very important. Why? Because language is not just a method of communication, but also a mechanism of power. In our country, for example, thanks to the long years of colonial rule, we learned that speaking English is more prestigious. And not knowing English would be something which is inadequate, and which is absolutely crazy, because you have another situation where you may not know your own mother tongue or your Indian language, but that would not be seen as a lack or a weakness. It would not be seen as something that needs to be remedied, but learning English would be seen as something which you lack social and cultural capital. Now see how, let's try and use the concept of habitus and dispositions and doxa and capital to see how language is both a product of a structure and reproduces structure. So what happens is the overall structure tells us that you must learn English. So we all try and learn English. In that process of doing so, we reproduce the privilege that English acquires. However, remember that it does not mean that we are passive victims of structure. We can change them. And the contemporary India, the contemporary world has seen that happen. The fact that people are far more confident in their Indian languages today than it were before. Final point, the last point, is reflexive sociology and what we mean by reflexive sociology. Bourdieu was intensely conscious of the effect of our own positions, our internalized structures. So he warned academics, researchers, sociologists that we don't only study society out there. I just don't go out and study peasants or women or agricultural workers or office workers or factory workers or middle class people. I must also be aware that I am a product of society and a habitus and a field. I too have doxa, and do I have my biases? Is the knowledge that I am creating knowledge free? So he was very, very particular about what he called a sociology of sociology, or a sociology of knowledge, a reflexibility, an awareness that I too can be an object of inquiry. That is the strength of reflexive sociology. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much for giving us this session. Friends, you're requested to write to us at info.cc@nic.in. This is the ID. Here you can post your questions as well as your feedbacks too. We are going to meet very soon again and would be discussing more. Till then, take care. Goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you.